there is this massive piece of architectural history hiding right in the sun-drenched coastal mountains of Europe.
Yeah, right out in the open, really.
Exactly. And it's something that anyone who loves pulling apart the mechanics of history, like you and me, absolutely needs to know about.
That's a fascinating one.
It really is. So today we are taking a deep dive into an article from Podcaster Capital. It's titled Stone Against Time. Really good title.
Yeah, great title.
And it outlines what historians actually call a medieval miracle. We're talking about the Walls of Stone in Croatia.
And it's one of those rare historical structures that completely defies your expectations, you know, like of what a small group of people could actually achieve.
Right. Because when you look at the visual sources for this, and I highly recommend you look this up if you're listening, it's wild.
It is almost disorienting if you're standing at the base of this thing today, just looking up.
I can imagine.
You've got this colossal, perfectly preserved limestone wall just aggressively zigzagging its way up a jagged, incredibly steep mountain ridge.
It genuinely looks like a matte painting from like a high-budget fantasy epic or something.
Yeah, like straight out of Lord of the Rings. But then you zoom in, and you can see modern hikers just walking along the top of it.
Okay, let's unpack this right away.
Yeah.
Because most walls of this scale throughout history, they were built by massive, sprawling empires, right?
Right, usually with unlimited resources.
Exactly. They were built to protect emperors or to hold back invading armies of hundreds of thousands of soldiers.
Yeah, imperial vanity projects, essentially.
Totally. But the mission of our deep dive today is to figure out how a tiny 14th century maritime republic managed to build a 5.5-kilometer mega project.
Without an emperor.
Without an emperor. And they didn't build it to protect a monarch at all. They built it to protect salt.
Which is just the perfect entry point, really, because you cannot understand why a defensive wall exists until you understand the exact mechanics of the treasure it's guarding.
Right. The why behind the wall.
Exactly. So we have to travel back to the year 1333.
Okay, setting the scene.
Yeah. And we need to look at the medieval economy of the Pelješac Peninsula. This is the year the Republic of Dubrovnik, which was historically known as Ragusa, acquired this very specific narrow strip of land that just sort of extends out into the Adriatic Sea.
And on a map, it doesn't look like much, right?
Not at all. It looks like a modest geographical feature, but it contained the exact geological and climate conditions necessary to produce something priceless.
White gold.
Yes. And what's fascinating here is how fundamentally we underestimate salt today. For us, it's just, you know, a cheap seasoning sitting in a shaker on the dining table. It costs like $1.
Right, you don't even think about it.
But in medieval Europe, salt wasn't a flavor enhancer. It was high-level preservation technology.
Because we're talking centuries before the invention of refrigeration.
Exactly. If a society wanted to store the autumn harvest just to survive the winter, they needed salt to cure the meat.
Otherwise, everybody starves.
Right. And if a merchant wanted to ship fish across a multi-week trade route without it rotting in the sun, they needed salt.
Wow, yeah.
And crucially, if a state wanted to provision a marching military, they needed massive, massive quantities of salt.
Okay, I think we need to put this in modern terms to really grasp the stakes here for you listening. Because controlling a highly productive salt pan in the 14th century, it was essentially like controlling a massive fleet of data centers today.
Oh, that's a brilliant comparison.
Or like having a near monopoly on the global semiconductor industry, you know. It wasn't just a tradable commodity. It was the critical foundational infrastructure that kept the entire societal operating system running.
Yeah, it was the baseline.
Right. If your salt supply gets cut off, your food rots, your armies starve, and your economy completely crashes.
That analogy actually scales perfectly. Because the salt pans near the town of Svusen, they were uniquely productive.
Just geographically speaking.
Yeah, the geography there created these shallow bays with the perfect mixture of intense Adriatic sun, very specific wind patterns, and the right tidal flow to accelerate evaporation.
So it was a natural factory.
Exactly. So for the Republic of Dubrovnik, protecting those natural evaporation basins wasn't just a matter of adding a lucrative export to their treasury. It was the absolute baseline of their national survival and their independence.
So because this white gold was the lifeblood of their nation, relying on a standard, run-of-the-mill medieval castle simply wasn't going to work.
No, not at all. You can't just drop a stone keep in the middle of town and dig a moat and call it a day.
Right, because they had to protect this expansive, sprawling industrial operation.
The footprint was huge.
Yeah, they needed a defensive envelope that wrapped around the entire geography of the salt pans.
And that sheer geographic necessity leads directly to the audacity of the engineering.
Which is wild.
It really is. They had to construct a continuous, unbroken defensive system connecting the town of ᵁᵖᵈᵃ, where the salt actually was, to the town of Walls of Ston on the other side of the peninsula's neck.
And how long is that stretch?
We are talking about 5.5 kilometers of continuous, heavily fortified masonry.
Over 3 miles of wall.
Yep. And they didn't get to build this on a flat, convenient plain.
Of course not. That would be too easy.
Right. The engineers had to route this wall through sinking coastal marshlands, up incredibly steep, unstable hillsides, and over jagged, rocky ridges.
Wow.
They were effectively severing the entire peninsula from the mainland.
Wait, I have to push back on this for a second. Because I hear 14th century mega project, and I hear it spanning mountains and swamps, and my brain instantly assumes this was built on the backs of a massive enslaved labor force.
Yeah, that's the standard historical trope.
Right. Or that it was funded by crushing taxes that just ruined the peasantry of some sprawling empire. How does a maritime city-state, this tiny republic, pull off imperial-level infrastructure without an empire's resources?
It's a great question, and it really separates Dubrovnik from the empires of antiquity. They didn't rely on slave labor.
Really?
No, they relied on hyper-organized civic administration and just brilliant local adaptation. They actually paid skilled laborers.
Okay, wow. That's progressive for the 1300s.
It really is. And financially, the salt itself funded the wall. It was a closed economic loop.
Oh, that makes so much sense. The product pays for its own security system.
Exactly. And from an engineering standpoint, they didn't bankrupt themselves importing exotic marble or specialized materials. They relied entirely on locally quarried limestone.
But wait, how do you build a multi-ton stone wall across a sinking coastal marshland? I mean, limestone is incredibly heavy. Doesn't the whole thing just sink into the mud?
That's where their grasp of lime mortar technology was so crucial.
Okay.
They utilized these specific mixtures of hydrated lime and local aggregates that could cut slowly and actually provide slight flexibility.
So it could adapt to the shifting ground.
Exactly. And in the marshy areas, they drove dense arrays of wooden pilings deep into the anaerobic mud.
Anaerobic meaning?
Meaning there's a lack of oxygen down there, which actually prevents the wood from rotting.
Oh, wow. That is so clever.
Right. It created a stable, artificial bedrock. And once that foundation was secure, they built upward, integrating 7 major fortresses and exactly 41 towers into the 5.5-kilometer stretch.
41 towers. Okay, if you do the math on that across 5.5 kilometers, that is a fortified tower roughly every 130 meters.
Which is very dense.
Yeah.
And that spacing is the genius of the design. It wasn't arbitrary at all. The builders were creating a very specific geometry of defense. By pushing those towers out from the main curtain wall at 130-meter intervals, they gave their archers and crossbowmen overlapping fields of fire.
Okay, I want to make sure I'm visualizing this right. It's essentially a medieval crossfire grid.
That's a great way to put it.
It's like setting up a network of modern security cameras, right? Like
Yeah.
if an attacker tries to blind one camera, 3 other cameras still have them dead center in the frame.
That is exactly how it functioned. If an attacking force tried to mass against a flat section of the wall and, put up siege ladders, they weren't just taking fire from the guards directly above them.
Right.
They were taking devastating flanking fire from the towers on their left and their right.
Wow.
There were mathematically 0 blind spots along the entire 5.5 kilometers.
That is terrifying if you're an attacking army.
Truly. It was a highly advanced, integrated defensive engine designed to chew up infantry assaults while also featuring these sea-facing fortresses to repel maritime threats.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. Because this level of meticulous planning wasn't just the work of a few architects who were really good at geometry.
No, it ran deeper than that.
Right. It's a physical manifestation of the entire geopolitical philosophy of the Republic. Because the Republic of Dubrovnik was playing a very different game than the rest of Europe at the time.
Very different.
They were not your typical Game of Thrones style feudal kingdom.
No, they operated in a completely different paradigm.
Yeah.
Feudal kingdoms of that era, they were often obsessed with aristocratic warfare, right? knights charging into battle, conquering neighboring land for personal glory, expanding borders through bloodshed.
The usual medieval stuff.
Exactly. But Dubrovnik was a pragmatic maritime republic. Their entire societal operating system was built on trade, on complex diplomacy, and on maintaining this calculated, highly profitable neutrality.
So they didn't want to win wars. They wanted to avoid them completely.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the Walls of Ston functioned as economic policy expressed in stone.
I love that phrasing.
Thanks. The Republic's approach to defense was entirely preventative. They wanted to make the physical cost of attacking them so ungodly high that no one would even try.
Right.
The walls allowed Dubrovnik to project massive, undeniable power, secure their territorial borders, and protect their salt revenues without actually having to drain their treasury by deploying a massive standing army to fight in open fields.
It's the ultimate geopolitical deterrent. They basically built a giant do not enter sign, so physically intimidating that even superpowers respected it.
And we really need to remember who their neighbors were.
Right, they were sandwiched right between the expanding Ottoman Empire on one side and the fiercely competitive Venetian Empire on the other.
Both of those powers could have easily crushed Dubrovnik in a prolonged symmetrical war.
Easily.
But the wall changed the math.
It completely changed the math. Because an Ottoman or Venetian general would look at that ridge, look at the overlapping fields of fire, and realize that capturing the salt pans would cost them thousands of casualties.
In months of siege time.
Right. It simply wasn't worth the return on investment, so instead of invading, they just traded with them.
Which is exactly what Dubrovnik wanted.
Imagine what daily life must have been like within this highly functional, fortified ecosystem. Because it wasn't just a dead monument sitting on a hill, it was alive with constant activity.
Oh, yeah. You have to picture the kinetic energy of the place.
Right.
Up on the ridges, you have garrisons of guards regularly patrolling those internal stone routes. You have complex communication signals, flags by day, fires by night, just traveling from tower to tower across the hills.
With a medieval telegraph system.
Exactly. And down below the walls, shielded entirely from the outside world, you have this massive near-industrial operation happening.
The salt pans.
Right. Farmers and engineers are managing these carefully controlled evaporation basins, manipulating the flow of seawater, harvesting the salt seasonally.
You've got the military and economic hub of Skien on one side, managing the salt production, and then Mollystein on the other side, functioning as this bustling, protected maritime port.
Just loading that salt onto ships to trade across the Mediterranean.
The wall is literally binding this entire economy together.
And it worked. For centuries, Dubrovnik maintained its independence right in the middle of these clashing empires, combining very savvy tribute payments and diplomacy with this formidable, undeniable infrastructure.
But of course, history doesn't let anything stand frozen in time forever.
No, it really doesn't.
This strategy of deterrence was brilliant, but eventually, the absolute invincibility of Europe's Great Wall started to crack.
Yeah. The decline of the Walls of Ston wasn't a sudden defeat in battle, though. It was a slow, tragic combination of shifting technology, unyielding natural disaster, and eventually just human opportunism.
So what was the first big blow?
The first truly devastating blow was seismic. In 1667, a massive earthquake struck the Dubrovnik region.
Oh, wow. And a rigid limestone wall, no matter how brilliantly engineered with lime mortar, is going to struggle against sheer seismic shear forces.
Precisely. The earthquake caused massive structural fracturing along the wall. Entire sections collapsed or were just deeply compromised.
That's heartbreaking.
It is. And crucially, this natural disaster happened right as the technology of warfare was fundamentally changing across Europe.
The rise of gunpowder artillery.
Yes. For centuries, a thick stone wall was an impenetrable shield against arrows, crossbow bolts, even early siege engines.
Right, rocks bounce off.
Exactly. But a heavy iron cannonball carries immense kinetic energy. When artillery became mobile and powerful enough, it changed the physics of a siege entirely.
Because it just punches straight through.
Right. High, vertical stone walls, which were perfect for stopping infantry, suddenly became massive, brittle targets that could just be shattered by concentrated cannon fire.
So the military doctrine shifted.
It had to. Military architecture moved toward low, sloped earthworks and star forts that could absorb kinetic impact.
Right, they sink into the dirt rather than shatter.
Exactly. The towering walls of Ston simply couldn't withstand modern artillery, making them strategically obsolete. Wow.
And as they lost their military purpose, the human element really took a toll. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, the walls had fallen into severe, tragic disrepair.
So what does this all mean for the structure itself? The detail in the research that really stuck with me is how the local population interacted with the ruins.
Oh, this part is fascinating.
Because once the military abandoned the walls, locals actually started treating it like a hardware store.
Yes.
They began removing the limestone blocks for their own construction projects.
It's a very practical, if destructive, form of historical cannibalization.
It makes total sense, though. I look at it like modern people finding an abandoned, obsolete factory and stripping it for copper wire and spare parts.
That is exactly what it was.
Right, because if you are a 19th century farmer and you need to build a new barn or expand your house, why would you spend weeks paying to quarry new limestone when there's a giant, unused, unguarded wall of perfectly cut stone sitting right up the hill?
You wouldn't. You'd just take a cart up there.
Exactly. And it's a phenomenon that happens to historical monuments all over the world, from the Colosseum in Rome to Hadrian's Wall in England.
Oh, sure.
As large portions of the stone walls were scavenged and collapsed, nature just took over. Deep root systems fractured the remaining mortar. Vegetation completely swallowed the sections that were left.
It just disappears into the landscape.
Yeah. What had once been Europe's most ambitious defensive system quietly faded back into the mountain, just becoming an overlooked, overgrown relic.
For a long, long time, it was just ruined stone on hill.
Yeah.
But the physical foundation, the sheer scale of what they had built was still there.
The bones were still good.
Exactly. Those blocks were just waiting for a modern era to finally recognize their true value again. Which brings us to a much more recent chapter.
Yes. The rediscovery and meticulous restoration of the Walls of Ston over the last few decades is just a massive triumph for historical conservation.
When did this really start picking up?
The real turning point occurred in the late 20th century, particularly ramping up in the 1990s and 2000s, especially after Croatian independence. There was a renewed, intense drive to truly recognize and resurrect the cultural importance of this site.
And the researchers know that conservationists approach this incredibly carefully, because the instinct is just to rebuild it quickly to sell tickets.
Oh, totally. Slap some concrete on it and open the gates.
Right. But they had to balance the desire to give tourists safe access with the absolute need to maintain true historical authenticity.
Yeah.
It couldn't just be a sanitized theme park version of a medieval wall.
No, they were very strict about it. They had to source matching local limestone. They had to utilize traditional masonry techniques so the new mortar wouldn't chemically clash with the 14th century materials.
That sounds exhausting.
It was grueling manual labor. They were often working on those same steep, perilous inclines that the original builders faced 700 years ago.
Without modern cranes, I imagine, in some of those spots.
Exactly. But because of this painstaking work, the walls have been transformed from forgotten ruins into a living, breathing cultural monument.
Today, restored sections allow visitors to actually walk those long, incredibly steep stone stairways between Salt and Mallystone.
Have you seen the photos of the views from up there?
Yes. The views are unbelievable. You're up on this elevated ridge getting sweeping panoramic views of the Adriatic Sea.
It's gorgeous.
You look down one side and see the famous oyster farms of Mallystone Bay. And incredibly, this is the part that completely blows my mind. You look down the other side and see the historic salt pans, and they are remarkably still in operation.
That continuity is astonishing, isn't it?
It really is.
The Salt and Salt Works remain among the oldest continuously functioning salt production sites in all of Europe.
Wow.
They are still using the exact same shallow basin evaporation methods that the wall was built to protect 700 years ago.
That is just incredible.
It perfectly bridges the gap between the medieval industrial economy and modern heritage tourism.
Which brings us to why you, listening right now, should care about this today. Because it's very easy to say, wow, cool old rocks, and just move on with your day.
Right.
But this deep dive proves something fundamental. It proves that small states, or even small organizations and teams today, can achieve absolute greatness and outmaneuver massive competitors through hyper-organization and clear vision.
Absolutely.
It proves that physical infrastructure heavily dictates the security and success of a civilization. And it proves that heritage restoration isn't just an academic exercise in preserving the past. It creates real, sustainable economic opportunity for the present.
Historians rightfully call this a medieval miracle, and the evidence really justifies that title across multiple metrics.
Let's recap them.
First, you have the sheer scale. It remains one of the longest preserved fortification systems in Europe.
Right.
Second, its unique economic purpose. It was protecting industry, trade, and chemical preservation, rather than just military assets.
Salt data center.
Exactly. Third, the terrifying geographic complexity of the terrain they conquered.
Swamps and mountains.
Yep. Fourth, the geopolitical vision of a tiny republic executing an empire-sized mega-project to force peace through deterrence.
So smart.
And finally, its sheer longevity. 7 centuries later, despite catastrophic earthquakes, the invention of cannons, and generations of scavengers, large portions remain beautifully, defiantly intact.
It is incredible.
Yeah.
A massive, landscape-altering structure that was essentially built to protect the medieval equivalent of a freezer has survived the fall of empires.
Well put.
And now it's become this marvel for modern travelers who show up armed with cameras instead of crossbows. The walls stand today, not because they are magically indestructible, but because modern generations actively chose to do the hard work of preserving them and honoring their legacy.
You know, this raises an important question, and it's something I think is really worth reflecting on for a second.
Yep.
We've just spent this time exploring how a 14th century society mobilized massive, unprecedented resources to build a permanent stone monument. And they did it to protect what they valued most, their economic independence, represented by salt. It really makes you wonder, if archaeologists 700 years from now were to dig up the grand infrastructure that we are building today, what massive landscape-altering walls will they find?
Oh, wow.
Will they uncover the sprawling, climate-controlled shells of our data centers? Will they map the millions of miles of submarine fiber optic cables just wrapping around the ocean floor?
That's a haunting image.
And when they look at those structures, will they tell a story of our greatest fears, or will they be a monument to the things we valued above all else?
That is a brilliant thought to leave on, because the next time you season your dinner, or the next time you see a picture of the Great Wall of China, maybe your mind will wander to a steep, sun-drenched ridge in Croatia. Yeah. You'll remember the tiny, pragmatic republic that decided to build an impossible wall, not out of aristocratic pride, but because they knew exactly what they needed to survive, and they built it to last.
Every society constructs a relationship with time. Heritage represents the past made visible, while sustainability represents the future made negotiable. Between them lies the present, a space of decision rather than nostalgia. In theory, preservation protects collective memory. Buildings, monuments, and historic spaces function as cultural anchors, stabilizing identity across generations. They tell societies who they were, and therefore who they believe themselves to be. Yet preservation is never neutral. It requires resources, energy, political will, and moral prioritization. Climate responsibility introduces a competing framework. It asks not what should remain unchanged, but what must transform to ensure continuity of life. Where heritage seeks permanence, climate ethics demands adaptation. The tension between the two reveals a fundamental question. Is sustainability compatible with conservation when both depend on limited ecological and economic resources? Theoretical models of sustainable development argue for balance, integrating cultural value with environmental limits. However, practice often exposes imbalance. Restoration projects may prioritize symbolic visibility over systemic resilience, investing in aesthetic continuity while infrastructure, housing efficiency, and ecological restoration remain underfunded. This contradiction reflects a deeper philosophical dilemma. Heritage protects meaning derived from the past, while climate action protects conditions necessary for the future. When preservation becomes performance rather than responsibility, it risks transforming culture into spectacle. A sustainable perspective reframes heritage not as static objects, but as adaptive processes. Cultural continuity may depend less on preserving materials than on preserving livability. Breathable cities, resilient communities, and equitable access to resources. Thus, the question is not whether heritage should survive, but how it should evolve under planetary constraints. In this theoretical view, true preservation shifts focus from maintaining appearances to sustaining systems. Heritage becomes future-oriented, climate responsibility becomes cultural practice, and sustainability emerges not as compromise, but as the redefinition of value itself.